and I wanted to expose mainstream media for the tricks that they get up to. And I saw this case as probably the best case to do that with, and that's why I chose to make this 4-hour-long documentary.
He had an insight into the true investigation, quotes, investigation, into allegedly trying to find Madeleine.
This is a silly story where my child is missing, and I'm talking about the curtains and blowing and all sorts of emotions. That's where someone who is a police officer, even without terrific training, will say, storytelling.
Sandra, maybe you should be asking the judiciary because they've examined all this.
So you don't have any explanation for that?
Ask the dogs, Sandra.
Ask the dogs, no, Jerry. Now I think that I feel free to ask you.
An emergency mode tells us this was not unexpected, this was not an emergency. Richard.
It begins with a cry that still echoes across the world. They've taken her. On the night of May 3rd, 2007, in the quiet Portuguese resort town of Praia da Luz, Kate McCann rushed into a restaurant where her friends were dining. Her face was pale, her voice trembling, and those 3 words spilled out like lightning, breaking the calm. Within minutes, the world would be told that 3-year-old Madeleine McCann had been abducted from her bed while her parents were only a few meters away. Headlines erupted overnight. Kidnapped, abducted, a predator in the night. Television crews, government officials, and newspapers across continents repeated the same version of events as if it were carved in stone. The story became the tragedy of a child stolen by a faceless stranger. A story so gripping that it froze millions of hearts and made Madeleine's photograph one of the most recognizable images on the planet. But beneath that initial flood of sympathy and shock lies a darker question. What if the story we were told was never the truth? What if the scene presented to the world was not an abduction at all, but something carefully constructed? An illusion shaped to conceal what really happened inside that holiday apartment? The case of Madeleine McCann has been called one of the most haunting mysteries of our time, a puzzle that refuses to fade even after nearly 2 decades. Yet, when stripped of headlines and media frenzy, the evidence left behind whispers a different story. It is a story of contradictions, of silence, of photographs that do not align with reality, and of testimonies that sound more rehearsed than remembered. From the very first night, a narrative was placed before us like a stage play. The open window, the swaying curtains, the missing child. But the deeper one looks, the more that narrative fractures. What if the real danger was never outside the apartment walls, but hidden within them? And if the abduction never happened, then the most chilling question remains. What really did? At the center of the official narrative lies a single image, a photograph that has come to be known as the last photo. It shows a smiling Madeleine McCann in a pink sun hat, sitting by the pool at the Ocean Club with her father Jerry and her sister. According to the family, it was taken on May 3rd, 2007, just hours before she disappeared. For years, this snapshot has been treated almost like sacred proof that Madeleine was alive that very afternoon. But what if this picture is not what it claims to be? Independent analysts began to notice details that did not add up. The first red flag was the light. Shadows in the photograph fall almost directly beneath the subjects, suggesting the sun was positioned high overhead. Yet by 2:29 p.m. on May 3rd, the sun should have already shifted westward, casting longer shadows. Then came the weather. Meteorological records show that May 3rd was mostly cloudy and windy in Praia da Luz. But the photograph reveals a flawless sky and blazing sunshine, conditions that did not exist that day. Experts concluded that the weather in the photo matched April 29th, the only day of the McCann holiday week when the Algarve skies were clear and cloudless. That Sunday was also recorded as the family's first day at the pool. If true, then this image was not a record of May 3rd at all, but of an earlier, very different moment in the holiday. The next problem was the metadata, the hidden digital fingerprint embedded in every photograph, showing when, where, and with what device it was taken. In this case, all of that information had been stripped away before the photo was released. Analysts argue that this was no accident, but a deliberate erasure of evidence that could confirm the true date. Even Madeleine's appearance in the picture raises unsettling doubts. Compared to other images taken during the trip, her features seem slightly older, her face more defined. as if the photograph captured her earlier in the week rather than on May 3rd. If that is the case, then there are no verifiable images of her taken after April 29th, a chilling 4-day void. Why does this matter? Because the last photo is not just a family keepsake, it is the keystone holding up the official story. If the photo was staged, altered, or misdated, then the timeline collapses. The narrative of abduction on May 3rd becomes impossible to sustain. The world was shown an image meant to reassure, but it may instead be the first sign of a cover-up. When Kate McCann ran back to the apartment on the night of May 3rd, she described a scene that would be repeated endlessly across the world. The bedroom window wide open, the curtain billowing in the night breeze, and Madeleine gone without a trace. It was an image made for headlines, a perfect symbol of a child snatched into the dark. But when investigators examined the actual apartment, the facts told a very different story. The window that supposedly served as the kidnapper's entry point showed no signs of forced entry. The lock was intact, the latch unbroken, and the frame carried no scratches or damage. A burglar forcing his way through would have left behind scars on the wood or glass, but none were found. The only fingerprint recovered from the window belonged not to an intruder, but to Kate McCann herself, the very person who claimed to have discovered it open. Beneath that window was a soft flower bed. Its soil was fragile, easily disturbed by weight. Had anyone climbed out carrying a child, the earth would have registered the intrusion with footprints, broken stems, or scuff marks. Yet the soil lay untouched, as pristine as if no one had been there at all. The curtain, too, betrayed the story. For it to sway dramatically in the wind, as Kate described, the shutters would have had to be wide open. But investigators concluded they could not have been pried from the outside without leaving marks, and none were ever found. Piece by piece, the supposed crime scene dissolved. No foreign fibers in the bedding, no hair or DNA from an unknown intruder, no footprints leading away from the apartment into the night. Every forensic clue pointed not to a stranger forcing entry, but to the absence of one. This leaves a chilling possibility. If no one broke in, then perhaps the abduction never happened. Perhaps what the world was shown was not evidence of a crime, but a carefully staged scene meant to create the illusion of one. The open window, the fluttering curtain, the empty bed, symbols of a kidnapping that forensic reality could not support. And if the crime scene itself was theater, then the story we have been told from the very beginning may be less about an abductor in the night and more about the crafting of an alibi. When British investigators brought in their most trusted canine team, the story of Madeleine McCann took a dramatic turn. Eddie, a cadaver dog trained to detect the scent of human remains, and Keela, a blood detection dog with a flawless track record, entered apartment 5A, the McCann's holiday flat. Their reactions were immediate, chilling, and undeniable. Eddie alerted behind the living room sofa. He alerted again in the bedroom where Madeleine had slept. He picked up the scent on Kate McCann's clothing, on the key to the family's rental car, and even on Madeleine's beloved toy, Cuddle Cat. Keela, working independently, confirmed the presence of human blood in the same locations. Days later, when the dogs were taken to the Renault Scenic, the car the McCanns had hired weeks after Madeleine disappeared, both reacted once more. To seasoned handlers, these were not random alerts. They told a story of death and concealment. Yet the most striking detail was not where the dogs reacted, but where they did not. Neither Eddie nor Keela gave any response near the bedroom window, the very place Kate McCann claimed a kidnapper had entered and escaped with Madeleine. No scent of death, no trace of blood, no indication that anyone had carried a child through that route. The supposed point of abduction was silent. In other cases, such alerts would have reshaped an investigation. Eddie and Keela had been instrumental in countless British murder inquiries. Courts had trusted their findings. Detectives had followed their noses to buried victims and hidden evidence. But in Madeleine's case, their alerts were brushed aside, dismissed as unreliable, or simply ignored. Richard D. Hall and other independent investigators raised the same question. Why? Why would these dogs, considered gold standard in every other case, suddenly be treated as if their senses were worthless? Was it because their findings pointed to a reality too inconvenient for the official narrative? Together, the dogs painted a dark picture, not of a stranger breaking in and stealing a child, but of something terrible happening inside the McCann apartment itself. And if their noses were right, Madeleine never left that flat alive. As the official narrative of abduction began to show cracks, a series of supposed suspects emerged, phantoms who appeared at just the right time to keep the spotlight fixed on the idea of a stranger in the night. Richard D. Hall calls them ghost suspects, because each one seemed less like a real lead and more like a character in a carefully constructed play. The first was Tanner Man. Jane Tanner, a friend of the McCanns and part of the Tapas group dining with them, claimed she saw a man walking swiftly across the street carrying a child in pale pajamas around 9:15 p.m. Her testimony became the backbone of the abduction theory. Yet, there were glaring problems. At the exact same moment, Jerry McCann was standing nearby speaking with another holidaymaker, Jeremy Wilkins. Neither Jerry nor Wilkins saw Jane Tanner, and neither saw any man carrying a child. How could one woman see what two men, only meters away, completely missed? Then came Smithman. On the same night, an Irish family reported seeing a man carrying a sleeping child through the dimly lit streets of Praia da Luz. At first, it looked like another promising lead. But months later, Martin Smith admitted something disturbing. The man's appearance, his manner of walking, strongly reminded him of Jerry McCann himself. If true, this was explosive. Yet the media swiftly buried the story, treating it as irrelevant instead of investigating its implications. Next was Sagrisman, a Polish tourist accused of suspiciously photographing children at a beach days before Madeleine disappeared. The narrative painted him as a predator lurking nearby. But timelines and witness accounts quickly collapsed under scrutiny. He had already left Portugal before May 3rd. Still, headlines carried his name, distracting the public with another shadowy figure. Years later came Kresh Dad, the supposed revelation that Tanner Man was simply an innocent father carrying his own child back from the resort nursery. This solution arrived 6 years after Madeleine's disappearance, just as the Tanner sighting had grown too weak to sustain. For Hall, this was a retroactive patch, a convenient way to close off a shaky detail without undermining the abduction story. Taken together, these suspects form a pattern. Each one was introduced when pressure mounted, when doubts about the official narrative grew too loud. Each one steered public attention back toward the idea of a faceless abductor and away from uncomfortable questions about the McCanns themselves. They were not genuine suspects in a real investigation, Hall argues. They were props in a story, ghosts conjured to preserve the illusion. And in chasing these ghosts, the world may have been led further and further away from the truth. On the night Madeleine was reported missing, Kate and Jerry McCann were not alone. They were dining with a close circle of friends, 7 adults who would come to be known as the Tapas 7. Their testimonies should have provided clarity, shining light on the critical hours when Madeleine vanished. Instead, their words formed something far more unsettling, a wall of silence. From the very beginning, their accounts aligned with uncanny precision. Each one repeated the same core story of the so-called checking system, where parents supposedly left the dinner table at intervals to check on their children sleeping in the nearby apartments. Small details varied, minutes blurred, routes shifted, but the central structure remained intact, almost rehearsed. Investigators quickly noticed that the testimony sounded too polished, too consistent. Real memories, especially from nights filled with fear and confusion, are messy. They contradict, they fracture, they evolve. These did not. When Portuguese police examined the timelines more closely, problems emerged. Some of the checks overlapped in ways that made little sense. There were long gaps where the children were left alone. And crucially, the timing of these visits left almost no realistic opportunity for a kidnapper to slip inside unnoticed. The system, rather than proving Madeleine was safe, seemed designed to create the appearance of vigilance. Inspector Tavares de Almeida, one of the lead investigators, grew suspicious. His 2007 report concluded that Madeleine likely died inside the apartment, and that a staged abduction was used to cover it up. He suspected that the Tapas 7 knew more than they admitted, perhaps even shielding the McCanns themselves. Allegations of a pact of silence began to circulate, an unwritten agreement that loyalty and reputation would outweigh uncomfortable truths. The group, through the McCann spokesman Clarence Mitchell, denied the accusations. They claimed they were simply respecting Portugal's judicial secrecy laws. Yet the silence endured, not just in 2007, but in 2017, and even today. Not one member of the group has ever broken ranks. Their voices remain united, their statements rigid, even as memories that should naturally blur with time remain frozen in place. Hall calls this silence a form of passive complicity, not by actively lying, but by refusing to challenge, by choosing loyalty over clarity. Silence became self-preservation, and self-preservation became protection. The British press, sympathetic to the McCanns, rarely pressed the group with difficult questions. Instead, their restraint was framed as dignity rather than suspicion. But the implications are staggering. If the Tapas 7's testimony was coordinated, then the entire official timeline of Madeleine's disappearance, the very spine of the abduction narrative, collapses. The checks, the last sightings, the alibis, all could be little more than a carefully constructed fiction. And if that is true, then the silence of 7 friends may be the greatest barrier standing between the world and the truth of what really happened to Madeleine McCann. Words can be more revealing than fingerprints. From the very first night, the statements of Kate and Jerry McCann carried subtle cues, phrases and omissions that experts believe betrayed more than they intended. Consider Kate's infamous cry, "They've taken her." At first, it sounds like the desperate outburst of a shocked mother, but statement analysts like Peter Hyatt point out its strangeness. Why speak in terms of abduction immediately? Why not say, "she's gone," or "Madeleine is missing"? The words seemed less like discovery and more like prescriptive knowledge, an instant narrative of kidnapping formed before any evidence had been gathered. Then there is Jerry's peculiar choice of phrasing in interviews. Asked about his daughter's fate, he once said, "There is no evidence Madeleine came to harm." On the surface, it appears reassuring, but to Hyatt, it sounded like the language of a lawyer, not a grieving father. It did not deny harm outright, it avoided it. True denial is simple and direct. We didn't hurt her. Yet neither parent ever spoke those plain words. Instead, they leaned on persuasive phrases like, "We would never harm her," language designed to convince, not to declare. Perhaps the most unsettling moment came when Jerry was pressed about the cadaver dogs. Their alerts to the apartment and rental car were devastating. Instead of confronting the evidence, Jerry dismissed it with sarcasm. "Ask the dogs." Hyatt calls this a red flag, turning damning evidence into ridicule rather than addressing it honestly. Even slips of the tongue offered haunting glimpses. At one point, Jerry began to recall Kate's alarm. "She can't be," before cutting himself short. Hyatt suggests the missing word was dead. It was a momentary fracture, a glimpse of the unspoken. And then there is the silence. For all their interviews, press conferences, and carefully worded statements, the McCanns have never once delivered a direct, unequivocal denial. "We did not kill Madeleine." That absence is, in Hyatt's analysis, louder than any scream. Silence, he insists, is itself a confession. Piece by piece, the words of the parents echo the same patterns seen in the evidence. A narrative built for persuasion, not for truth. Storytelling, where raw denial should stand. Convincing, where clarity should speak. And in that silence, where the simplest words are missing, analysts hear the most chilling truth of all, that Madeleine did not vanish into the night, but died in the apartment, and the story of abduction was built to hide it. If the evidence inside the apartment raised doubts, and the words of the parents deepened them, then the role of politics and media built a fortress around the official narrative. From the very beginning, the McCanns were not treated like ordinary parents in a missing child case. They were protected, elevated, and defended by some of the most powerful institutions in Britain. Central to this was Clarence Mitchell, a former head of the UK government's media monitoring unit. Mitchell was dispatched to manage the McCann story. His job was not simply to answer questions, but to control the lens through which the case was seen. He admitted openly that his role was to shape what came out in the press. For more than a decade, he became the family's chief spokesman, feeding hundreds of stories to newspapers, planting angles that reinforced the abduction theory, and attacking anyone who suggested otherwise. Portuguese officials accused him of manipulation, of bending reality with a smile. Behind the scenes, other forces worked to neutralize evidence. When DNA samples from the apartment and the Renault Scenic were sent to the UK's Forensic Science Service, the results leaned toward Madeleine. Yet the official conclusion labeled them inconclusive. That single word gave authorities the cover to dismiss the damning alerts of Eddie and Keela, to bury uncomfortable science beneath technical vagueness. Meanwhile, political pressure mounted. Within days of Madeleine's disappearance, British diplomats arrived in Praia da Luz. Prime Minister Gordon Brown personally intervened, lobbying Portuguese officials and ultimately ensuring the removal of Detective Gonçalo Amaral, who had begun to suspect the parents. Such direct interference was unprecedented, turning what should have been a criminal investigation into a diplomatic storm. Whispers of MI5 involvement only added to the sense that this was no ordinary case. And through it all, the media played not as watchdog, but as accomplice. British tabloids splashed every alleged sighting, every phantom suspect, across their front pages. They amplified Tanner Man, Smith Man, and the ghosts of strangers. But they downplayed the dogs, the DNA, the contradictions. They created a global campaign, making Madeleine a brand recognized at football matches and papal audiences, while the forensic realities were quietly shelved. Richard D. Hall's conclusion is grim. If Madeleine died around April 29th, as he argues, then what followed was not a search for truth, but a coordinated cover-up. A child's death became not only a family tragedy, but a political liability, one buried beneath layers of narrative control. And so we are left with a warning that reaches far beyond a single case. If governments, media, and institutions can rewrite the story of a missing child, what else can they rewrite? When evidence can be labeled inconvenient, when silence can be mistaken for dignity, when power decides what truth is allowed to surface, then truth itself becomes fragile, perhaps even disposable. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann may forever remain unsolved, but what it revealed is clear, that the most dangerous predator may not have been outside the apartment at all. It may have been the machinery of influence, political, media, and institutional, working to ensure that the world never knows what really happened in Praia da Luz.